The morning sun had not yet burned through the mist when the young rancher rode into town, his boots heavy with dust and his pride barely holding together. The streets of Red Bluff were quiet except for the sound of hammers from the blacksmith's yard and the clink of bottles from the saloon porch. Folks turned their heads as he passed, their whispers following him like shadows. Just a week ago they had laughed at him, mocked him in front of everyone for something he didn't even do. To them, he was just another half-blood rancher trying to play cowboy among men who'd never seen him as equal. But they didn't know the kind of fire that burned inside him, nor the bloodline that ran in his veins. He had come into Red Bluff that day to sell cattle hides and trade for supplies. He was quiet, always kept to himself and didn't look for trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him. The older ranch hands from the McCready spread never liked him. They said he worked too fast, rode too well, and carried himself like a man who didn't need permission. Jealousy mixed with ignorance made a deadly brew, and that afternoon they poured it all over him in the middle of Main Street. They mocked his heritage, his clothes, the way he spoke few words. When he refused to fight, they pushed him, spat near his boots, and tore the reins from his horse. The laughter of the town echoed off the walls, cutting deeper than any knife. He didn't raise his hand. He just looked at them, eyes calm as a storm before it breaks, and rode out of town without a word. But something changed that day. Those who had humiliated him didn't see the look that passed in his eyes when he turned his horse toward the canyons. They didn't know the land he rode back into, wild country stretching beyond the horizon, guarded by men who had no law but loyalty. The young rancher had grown up between two worlds. His mother was a settler's daughter, and his father a respected Apache warrior. For years he had walked a thin line between peace and pride. He wanted a quiet life, raising cattle, mending fences, keeping to himself. But the mockery he suffered lit an ember of anger that reached far deeper than personal insult. It was an insult to his blood, to the people who had fought and bled on that same land long before any ranch house stood there. Back at his small ranch near the foothills, he worked silently through the evening. The mountains glowed red in the last light, and coyotes began to howl from the ridges. His hands moved through the motions, saddling, checking the rifles, packing supplies, but his mind was far away. His late father's words came back to him, spoken in a language he hadn't used in years. When a man is wronged, he can forgive. But when a people are mocked, the earth remembers. He didn't want war. He didn't want revenge. But he knew what message he had to send, that he was not alone, and that those who carried pride in their blood would not bow forever. For the next few days, the town went on as usual. The men at the saloon bragged about how they made the quiet rancher look like a fool. The bartender laughed with them, and even the sheriff, half drunk, said he should have learned his place long ago. But while they laughed, the canyon stayed silent, watching. Riders moved through the shadows of the red rocks at night, leaving no tracks. Campfires burned low in hidden valleys. For miles around, warriors began to gather, answering an old call that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. They were not there for bloodlust or plunder. They came for honor, for respect, and for the young man who had once refused to take sides. The rancher spent those days alone, mending the same piece of fence over and over, thinking of what was about to come. He remembered the look of the townsfolk, how the children stared and how the women turned their faces away, ashamed to be seen showing kindness. He thought about his mother's grave, just beyond the cottonwoods, and how she had believed people could change. "They'll see your heart someday," she used to tell him. "Not just your skin or your blood." He wanted to believe that. But the truth of the frontier was different. Respect was never given, only taken, and once lost, it could only be regained through courage or through fire. The rancher's dog barked one night just before dawn. From the hill beyond his corral came the sound of distant drums, faint but steady. He rode out at first light and followed the echo until he reached the canyon where his father once led warriors in defense of their land. There, among the cliffs, stood men painted with ashes and feathers, armed with rifles and lances, faces lit by the rising sun. They said nothing when they saw him. He dismounted, walked forward, and stood in silence before them. An elder stepped out, a man with gray braids and sharp eyes that had seen too many winters. He spoke softly, calling him Son of Two Fires, and said the land had sent word of his humiliation. "You do not ask for vengeance," the elder said, "but the land asks for dignity." The young rancher's throat tightened. He had not come to start a war, but he couldn't turn them away. He told them he wanted only peace, that he sought to prove his worth as a man, not by destruction but by strength. Yet the elder shook his head. Peace cannot live where respect has died, he said. At dawn, they will see who you truly are. The warriors began to ready their horses, their weapons glinting in the morning light. The sound of hooves echoed through the valley like thunder rolling in from the distance. Back in Red Bluff, the same men who had mocked him sat outside the saloon, trading stories over cheap whiskey. They laughed about the rancher again, boasting how he must have ridden off for good. But the laughter began to fade when a rider galloped in from the north, dust flying off his coat. He was pale as snow when he spoke, saying he had seen something at the edge of the ridge. Hundreds of riders in the mist, moving like a river of shadows. The sheriff laughed it off at first, but others went quiet. The blacksmith stepped outside, wiping his hands, and stared toward the hills. A faint sound reached them then, a low, steady beat that made the ground tremble. By the time the first light touched the town, the people of Red Bluff could see dust rising in the east. Not the dust of a storm, but the dust of horsemen. Many horsemen. They came in perfect silence like ghosts born from the land itself, their faces marked with paint and purpose. At the center of it all rode the young rancher, his head high, eyes fixed on the same town that once laughed at him. The wind carried the echo of his father's tongue in his mind, reminding him that some battles are not fought for land or gold, but for the soul of a man. The townspeople stood frozen, unsure whether to run, hide, or pray. Mothers clutched their children, and men reached for rifles that suddenly felt too light. The rancher stopped his horse at the edge of Main Street, where a week ago he had been shoved to the dirt. He looked at the same faces, the same eyes that once mocked him, and said nothing. The silence was louder than any shout. Behind him, 300 warriors waited, motionless, the morning sun glinting off their weapons. No one knew what he would do next, or what his silence meant. The air was thick with fear, pride, and something ancient rising from the dust. As the wind shifted, the young rancher raised his hand slowly, not in anger, but in command. Every horse lifted its head at once, every rider waiting for his word. The people of Red Bluff held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. And in that stillness between the rising sun and the first cry of the day, one truth hung heavy in the air. The land remembers, and so do the men who belong to it. No one in Red Bluff spoke for a long while. The air was still except for the sound of horses breathing and the faint rattle of saddles. The young rancher sat tall in his saddle, the morning light cutting across his face, showing the calm of a man who had come not for blood but for truth. The sheriff finally stepped forward, trying to steady his voice though his hand trembled near his holster. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked, his eyes darting toward the line of warriors stretched across the plain. The rancher didn't answer. His gaze swept across the faces in front of him, the same men who had laughed, the same crowd that had looked away when he was humiliated. Now every one of them felt the weight of his silence. The warriors behind him stood still as stone, their faces painted with symbols of strength and loss. Their presence alone was enough to shake every man in town. These were not strangers. They were sons of the same earth, men whose ancestors had lived by the rivers long before fences or cattle herds claimed the land. The people of Red Bluff had forgotten that history, but the young rancher had not. He had spent years walking between two worlds, learning the language of the settlers while remembering the songs of his father's people. He was the bridge they tried to burn, and now that bridge had come back to stand before them. The sheriff lowered his voice, speaking like a man who hoped reason might hold off disaster. "You're outnumbered here, son. You bring them here and you'll only stir trouble none of us want." The rancher looked at him, calm but cold. "Trouble found me first," he said. His words were quiet, yet they carried across the street. The townsfolk shifted uneasily, their boots scraping against the dirt. The blacksmith's wife whispered a prayer under her breath, while an old woman from the boarding house wiped tears from her eyes. She had known the rancher's mother once and remembered when that boy was just a child playing near the river. That moment froze the town in its own guilt. Each person recalled how they had looked away that day, how they had watched him be mocked and done nothing. Now the land itself seemed to have turned its gaze upon them, asking for an answer. Yet the young rancher wasn't there to spill blood. He was there because something inside him demanded respect, not for himself alone, but for every man who had been stepped over and silenced. A week before, after leaving town, he had ridden far into the hills, to the high ridges where the river twisted through stone. That was where he found his father's old friend, the elder who had once fought to protect their people's hunting grounds. The elder had watched him approach in silence, the years showing deep in his eyes. He had known before a word was spoken what had happened. Around their fire that night, they spoke long about what it means for a man to live with two hearts, one belonging to the white world that taught him to build fences and trade cattle, and the other to the red earth that taught him to listen to the wind and respect what cannot be owned. The elder told him that such a man must someday choose which truth he stands for. The young rancher had not wanted to choose. His dream was simple: a quiet ranch, a herd of cattle, a piece of peace in a land that offered little of it. He had no thirst for revenge, but when a man's dignity is torn apart in front of others, peace becomes a far-off thing. The next morning he had found the old drums taken from their hiding place, and the riders waiting near the ridge. They came not because he called them, but because word had spread that a son of both worlds had been wronged. The days leading up to that morning had passed in a strange stillness. From the cliffs he could see the smoke of Red Bluff rising faintly against the plains. He had thought often of his mother's grave, how she had always told him to keep his heart steady even when the world turned against him. "Kindness isn't weakness," she used to say. "It's the courage to stand firm without hate." Her words echoed in his mind as he watched the warriors sharpen their blades and prepare their horses. He wondered if bringing them here was right. Would his mother forgive him for standing with men ready for war? Or would she have told him to ride back alone and face the town with nothing but his truth? The leader of the warriors, the gray-haired elder, had sensed his doubt. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, he placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Your mother's spirit is not angered," he said quietly. "She knows that peace must be earned. Today you do not fight them with guns. You fight them with memory." Those words stayed with him. Now, facing the town again, the young rancher could see the fear in their eyes, but also something deeper. Shame. The same men who had once jeered now stood silent, shifting uncomfortably beneath the weight of what they'd done. The sheriff lowered his gaze. "You've made your point," he said, his voice cracking. "Now tell them to go back before someone gets hurt." The rancher looked over his shoulder at the sea of riders stretching into the horizon. They waited patiently, no weapons drawn, only their presence speaking louder than words. "They came for respect," the rancher said. "Not to fight." His voice softened then. "You took from me what a man builds his life on, his honor. I came to take it back." In the crowd, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Ma," he whispered. "Is he the one they called names?" The woman nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. "Yes," she said. "And now they're the ones who'll have to remember it." The sheriff turned to the townsmen who had started the trouble. Their faces were pale, their pride cracked wide open. One of them tried to speak, to offer an excuse, but the rancher's quiet stare silenced him. In that stillness, the sound of hooves began to rise again, not approaching, but circling, a slow rhythmic beat like the heartbeat of the land itself. The warriors were not threatening, they were reminding. The dust around them shimmered in the sunlight as if the earth itself was breathing. The rancher sat unmoved, his hand resting lightly on the saddle horn. "I want no blood," he said. "I want you to remember what it means to respect a man, no matter the color of his skin or the way he speaks." The elder nodded from behind him, and a deep chant began, low and steady, echoing across the valley. It was not a war cry. It was a song of remembrance, of loss, endurance, and pride that could not be broken. The townsfolk listened, uneasy but silent. Some turned away, ashamed, while others stood still, knowing they were witnessing something far greater than their own pride. As the chant grew, the wind picked up, carrying dust across the town. The American flag in front of the sheriff's office flapped hard, its fabric snapping in the air. It was a strange picture. Two worlds standing side by side, both claiming the same soil, both scarred by history, both bound by the same sky. The young rancher knew this moment would never leave their minds. Whatever happened next, the town of Red Bluff would never look at him the same again. That night, long after the sun went down, the young rancher camped at the edge of the river. The warriors had returned to their lands, leaving behind silence and the echo of their drums. The town had not apologized, but they had lowered their guns and met his eyes with a kind of respect that words could not express. He sat beside the fire, listening to the crackle of wood and the soft rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. His horse grazed nearby, calm and untroubled. The stars above shone bright, like the same stars his father once spoke to in prayer. He thought about what would come next. Red Bluff might remember this day with fear, but he hoped they would remember it with understanding too. The young rancher didn't hate them. He only wanted them to see that a man's worth is not decided by where he was born or what blood runs in his veins. He wanted peace to return, but a peace built on equality, not silence. Still, deep down, he sensed it wasn't over. Pride dies slowly on the frontier. The men who had been shamed would not forget easily, and revenge often grows in quiet places. Somewhere beyond the ridge, someone was watching, waiting for a chance to strike back. The young rancher knew it. That was the way of the West. Peace never lasted long before the next storm rolled in. As the firelight flickered across his face, he looked toward the town in the distance. A faint glow marked the saloon lights, and in that glow he saw the shape of what tomorrow might bring. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps another fight. The sound of an owl carried through the night, lonely and haunting, and the river whispered below like a restless soul. The young rancher took a slow breath, steady and quiet. The battle for respect was not won in a day. It had only just begun. The river ran low the next morning, a band of silver that cut through cottonwoods and willows like a quiet line of truth. The young rancher saddled his horse before first light and checked the fence that bordered the public trail. He did every chore slow and careful, as if each rope knot and latch could hold back trouble. It felt like the earth was listening. Even the meadowlarks waited to sing. He had not slept much. Half the night he had watched the ridge where the last of the riders disappeared, wondering if their silence would be taken as a warning or a promise. The air smelled of sage and faint smoke drifting from town. In that smoke he could almost hear the talk brewing in Red Bluff, the pride stung and aching to strike back. By mid-morning, he rode into town alone. He had decided to meet whatever faced him with open eyes. The street carried the usual sounds of a frontier town, but there was a tightness to it. A teamster snapped his whip with a little more force than needed. Dogs stayed close to porches. The old schoolteacher paused in the doorway of the mercantile and stepped aside for him, not out of fear, but in a quiet show of respect. The blacksmith lifted a hand in greeting, and did not let it shake. Small Axe told him the town was split down the middle. Some felt shame, others felt anger. He tied his horse outside the feed store and stepped in to ask about salt blocks and wire. The shopkeeper kept his voice steady and his prices fair. It was the owner's son who could not hold his tongue. "You think you can scare us with a parade," the boy said, jaw tight. "You and your warriors from the hills." The rancher's face did not change. He waited for the bill and paid with coins worn smooth by many hands. "I came to trade," he said. "The land is big enough for all of us if respect rides with us." The boy muttered, but he said no more. When the young rancher turned to leave, he caught the eye of a woman by the window. She was mending a shirt for her little boy, needle moving in neat, patient bites. She gave the rancher a small nod that said more than any speech. On the edge of town, at the saloon where the floorboards always smelled of sour beer and old pipe smoke, voices rolled in low waves. Behind the bat-wing doors, the men who had started the trouble sat with heads together. The cattle boss from the big spread had come in early and set the tone. He had money tied up in contracts and no patience for a young man he could not push around. He spoke of law and order, but what he wanted was the order that came from fear. A few of his men had brothers up at the fort, and talk turned to telegraphs, militia, and how to make a lesson stick. Others were not so sure. The blacksmith's cousin reminded them what the ridge had looked like at dawn, when the riders stood in silence. "You bring soldiers to crush a point a man made without firing a shot," he said, "and you might turn a wound into a canyon." The sheriff sat at the far end of the bar, turning a tin cup in his hands. He knew the town better than anyone. He knew which men would find courage in whiskey and which would find foolishness. He also knew the plains. Soldiers might push back riders for a day. They could not arrest the wind or the memory of a people. Still, he had a duty to keep the peace. He told the room he would ride out to the young rancher's place and talk terms. When he stood, no one stopped him. A town wants to believe its law can still handle a storm. Back at the ranch, the young man had a visitor long before the sheriff appeared. The elder who had stood at his shoulder in the canyon came riding with two others, their horses moving at a steady trot that sent dust curling up from the trail. They tied their mounts under the cottonwoods and walked to the corral without hurry. The elder's eyes took in the lay of the land, the water gate, the watchstones on the ridge. He looked pleased to see the old ways carried into new life. "The land is your witness," he said. "It saw you stand. It saw their eyes change." The young rancher nodded but did not smile. He told the elder what he felt in town. Half of Red Bluff would like to forget. The other half wants to make sure no man tries such a thing again. The elder listened and then told him something he did not expect. There was talk among the riders, too. Some believed the work was done. Others believed a message should be carved deep, so it could not be rubbed out by the next dusty wind. The young man felt the pull of two fires again. He did not want a scar that would never heal. He wanted a line that taught and then faded as people learned to walk straighter. The elder put a small bundle on the fence post and unwrapped it. Inside lay a piece of painted rawhide, marked with symbols for memory and breath. "Carry this," he said. "It reminds you to speak with air, not iron. But it also reminds you to stand tall when words break." When the sheriff rode up, he found them at the corral. He tipped his hat to the elder and greeted the young rancher with the kind of respect he used when trouble made him careful. He spoke plain. The town was jumpy. The cattle boss had friends with paper and seals. Telegraph lines could travel faster than horses and bring soldiers with letters of authority. He asked for a promise that the riders would not gather again. He asked for time to settle the men who felt stung. The elder said that the riders had come and gone of their own will, not at anyone's command. The sheriff nodded at that and shifted to another point. The big spreads were pushing for a water agreement that cut small ranchers off the river during the dry months. He warned the young man that the show of strength had given those men a story to sell. They would call him a troublemaker and use it to grab more land and water under the color of law. That thought sat heavy on the rancher's chest. He had stood for dignity. He had no wish to hand over an excuse to men who wanted every pasture from the ridge to the valley. He thanked the sheriff for speaking honest. The elder watched both of them and said the river had always been shared by those who respected it. He reminded the sheriff that his own grandmother had boiled coffee at a winter camp alongside families from the hills. The sheriff gave a tired smile. "The river remembers," he said. "People forget." He promised to speak against any paper that tried to fence water, but he also warned that paper had a way of winning if folks did not stand together. In the days that followed, the main conflict widened like a river after rain. The rancher found signs that someone had cut his fence at night and scattered his small herd. He tracked the prints to a rocky rise where the trail broke apart in hard ground. It was a clean job done by hands that understood cattle. Far off, a single rider sat on a slope and watched him for a long while, then drifted away. The message was clear. A man could be respected to his face and robbed in the dark. The rancher set about mending fences and moving his cattle into a tighter circle near the cottonwoods. He also began visiting his neighbors, small outfits like his, some with families and some just starting out. They spoke on porches while children filled buckets at the pump and hens scratched in the dust. Those talks gave birth to a small alliance. They would share riders, share water in dry spells, and keep eyes on the ridges. It was simple frontier justice built on trust. In town, a different story was taking shape. A railroad survey crew arrived with measuring rods and a tin box of maps. They set up near the depot and drew lines across paper that crossed creeks, lots, and even the churchyard. The arrival set the saloon buzzing. A line of iron could bring prosperity, but it also brought strangers, taxes, and fresh fights over right-of-way. The cattle boss saw new markets for beef and new leverage over land. The blacksmith saw more shoes to set and more nights where the roar of trains might drown the quiet of the stars. The school teacher saw new books for the children. The preacher saw a flood of souls and the need for steadier hands. The survey crew's foreman invited the ranchers to a meeting about the proposed track. He spoke fast about progress and used words like improvement and development. He promised a siding near Red Bluff and work for men who could swing hammers. He also showed a line that ran straight through the common grazing area where small outfits watered their herds in summer. When the young rancher pointed that out, the foreman shrugged. It was only a line on a map for now. Lines on maps have a way of turning into fences and fines. The room grew tense. The sheriff stood up and said the town would not sign any promise that cut out the small men. The cattle boss laughed that off and said the world moved forward and slow folk got left behind. The young rancher kept his temper, but inside he felt the old fire rise. Respect was not just a word traded between men. It lived in the shape of land and the reach of water. Subplots grew from the larger struggle like branches on a cottonwood. The blacksmith's boy, the same one who had run his mouth in the feed store, began stopping by the ranch with small excuses. He wanted to learn roping. He wanted to see how a quiet horse was trained to neck rein. The rancher could have turned him away. Instead, he put a rope in the boy's hands and taught him to make a clean loop. He told him that a rope holds best when you do not jerk it. The boy asked questions about the riders at dawn. The rancher answered without boasting. He told the boy that strength is not just the power to strike, but the ability to stand so others see where the true line is. One afternoon, the boy admitted his pa was on the side of the big spreads because they paid good money. The rancher said money feeds a family, and a man should not be ashamed of work. But a man should also remember what kind of world he is building for his children. Another thread wound through the story when the old school teacher brought a bundle of letters to the ranch. She had kept them for years, letters from families who once traded bread and stories at winter camps, settlers and people from the hills both. She thought the town should hear those voices again. The rancher opened one by the fire. It spoke of a night when a snow squall had buried every trail, and two neighbors had cut wood together to keep every child warm. He read until the words blurred. He felt a plan taking shape that fought with memory, not bullets. A gathering, a telling of shared history, songs and letters under stars. He pictured it in the meadow near the river, lanterns swinging like small moons. The thought filled him with hope, but hope is a tender plant on the frontier. It needs shelter to grow. The cattle boss had no interest in songs. He sent 3 riders to see the sheriff with a formal complaint. They claimed the young rancher had threatened the town by bringing riders, and that his presence put the rail contract at risk. They wanted him fined or banned from town for a time. The sheriff refused. Law did not stretch that far. Still, word of the complaint stirred up corners of Red Bluff that had gone quiet. At the depot, somebody knocked a crate off a platform and scrawled a slur in chalk on the boards. The blacksmith scrubbed it away before the school children could see it, then walked to the cattle boss's men and told them his shop would no longer serve those who could not hold their tongues. It was a small stand, but small stands add up like fence posts down a long line. On the ridge, the elder felt the pressure building too. He gathered a few families in a circle and spoke about patience. He reminded them that the young rancher had chosen the hard road of memory and breath. A handful of younger riders argued that only a show of force kept greedy hands off water and grass. The elder did not lecture. He took them to the river at dusk and stood quiet until the first coyotes called. "You hear that," he said. "They speak without hate. They say we are here. That is enough most nights." He did not promise it would always be enough. He only promised to watch the signs and answer with wisdom, before any hothead answered with fire. All the while, the survey crew kept pounding markers into the soil. Every stake they drove felt like a finger pushing into a bruise. One evening, the rancher followed their line until it crossed the narrow creek that fed his lower pasture. He stood there a long time. He saw how a siding might drain the creek in dry months and leave the cottonwoods stunned. He imagined his small herd nosing dust where water should shine. He imagined the school children in town growing up with trains and forgetting the slow talk of rivers. He did not hate trains. He only wanted them to come in a way that did not break the old promises of the land. He rode home under a sky so clear that the stars looked like nails hammered into a dark board. Near the turn in the trail, he felt eyes on him. A shadow moved along the mesquite and then another. He eased his horse to a stop and waited, hands open on the horn. 2 riders stepped out from the brush with faces he did not know. They kept their hands near their belts without touching the handles. One spoke, saying the big spread had offered good pay for information about the elder and where the riders met. He could make life easy if he spoke plain. The rancher did not reach for iron. He told them he was the wrong man to ask. He told them a truth he hoped would hold. "This land is done with secrets that harm," he said. They stared at him for a heartbeat and then drifted back into the brush. He rode on, but he did not relax. The night felt thinner than usual. The veil between quiet and trouble stretched tight. At the ranch, he banked the fire and sat with his back against the door. The dog slept with one eye open. He thought about the gathering by the river and whether the town would come. He thought about the sheriff, a good man boxed in by bad paper. He thought about the boy with the rope and the letters that remembered a winter when neighbors chose to live together. He thought about the railroad stakes marching like soldiers across the valley. His mind moved between hope and caution, between trust and the lessons of hard seasons. By dawn, a thin mist hung over the grass. He walked to the water and dipped his hands into the cold. The river did not judge. It only asked to be treated right. On the far bank, a hawk lifted from a cedar and floated in a wide circle, reading the ground for what moved. The young rancher watched it and felt the same hunger for sight, for a way to know where the next step should land. He wiped his hands, saddled up, and pointed his horse toward Red Bluff with a plan forming like the first line of a trail. He would invite the town to the river, to letters and songs and a meal shared under stars. He would ask the sheriff to stand at his side. He would ask the school teacher to read and the blacksmith to speak. He would ask the cattle boss to listen, even if his face stayed hard as a rock. He knew not everyone would come. He knew some would call it a trick, a theater to cover a future strike. He knew some would laugh behind doors and sharpen knives for the next dark job. Still, he would make the offer. He would build a bridge with memory while keeping his fences strong and his riders ready. As he rode, the sun climbed and brushed the tips of grass with gold. The town's roofs glinted like coins stacked on the edge of a table. Balance, he told himself. Hold the balance even when the table shakes. On the hill above the depot, he pulled up to take in the scene below. Men gathered around the survey crew. The sheriff's horse was tied to the rail outside his office. A freight wagon rattled toward the mercantile with sacks of flour piled high. Life was moving as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He touched the rawhide bundle at his chest, the symbol for memory and breath warm against his shirt. He took a steady breath and started down the slope, not knowing that behind him, on a far ridge, a glass glinted in the sun, as someone watched his every move and made a different plan for the night to come. The day held its breath. The river flowed on. The next turn in the trail waited just beyond the cottonwoods. By the next sunset, a different kind of silence had fallen across the valley. The wind carried no songs from the canyons, only the low moan of dry grass brushing against fence posts. The young rancher stood by the corral, watching the horizon glow red, knowing something was coming. Trouble had a way of sending signs. A dead steer found near the creek, tracks of horses that didn't belong, a whisper that rode faster than the mail coach. He could feel it like the charge before lightning. The air itself felt uneasy. That evening, the sheriff rode up again, hat low, face shadowed by worry. He dismounted slow, not as a man of authority this time, but as one who'd come to speak truth. He said a telegram had gone out at dawn. The cattle boss had called for soldiers from Fort Willow under the claim that native raiders were gathering near Red Bluff, endangering settlers and the rail line. The young rancher understood right away what that meant. The boss wanted fear, not justice. He wanted the army to do what his men couldn't, wipe away the shame of being stood down by a quiet man and 300 warriors. The sheriff's voice trembled as he said the troops were expected within 2 days. He didn't know what they'd find when they came, but he begged the young man to keep his people away from town. If they ride in and see camps or painted riders, they'll fire first and think later, he said. The rancher's jaw tightened. He promised he wouldn't start a fight, but he couldn't promise to run either. You can't ask a man to step off the land that raised him, he said softly. You know that as well as I do, the sheriff nodded. His eyes said more than words ever could. He left a small packet of papers, letters from townsfolk who wanted peace, and rode off into the fading light, his horse kicking dust like smoke behind him. That night, the young rancher gathered a few friends from neighboring spreads. They sat around a fire, the kind that burns low and steady when men speak of serious things. Among them was the blacksmith, his hands still blackened from the forge, and the schoolteacher, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. She had come to talk about the gathering by the river, the one meant to bridge the two sides through letters and songs. She said the church women had agreed to bring bread and stew, though some were afraid. The blacksmith said his boy had been threatened for visiting the ranch. The young rancher listened quietly. He told them the meeting would still happen. If we give in to fear, he said, we let the liars write our story. They agreed, though none spoke of the danger that hung over the plan like a storm cloud waiting for wind. The next day dawned too still. Even the birds seemed cautious. From the ridge above his ranch, the young man saw dust trails near the eastern plain, riders scouting the land. He could tell by their posture they weren't ranchers. They were looking for something, or someone. He saddled his horse and rode north toward the hills, where the elder might be camped. The trail twisted through red rock and sage, and by noon he found the signs. Smoke from cooking fires and the echo of drum beats, faint and steady. When he rode in, the warriors turned to him with quiet eyes. They already knew. Scouts had seen soldiers on the move from the fort, with wagons, rifles, and the old flag snapping in the wind. The elder stood by the fire, staff planted firm in the ground. The wind says the soldiers come not to talk, he said. They carry words written by fearful men. The rancher told him about the gathering by the river, that it might be their only chance to show the truth before guns spoke. The elder looked long into the fire. Words can heal if the ears are open, he said. But words can burn if spoken into fear. Still, he promised to come, bringing only unarmed men and their drums. They would stand in the open, not to fight but to be seen. The rancher thanked him, but inside, his chest felt heavy. He knew that on the frontier, misunderstandings killed faster than bullets. When he returned home that night, the moon hung low and orange. He found the fence gate open again, and this time, blood on the post. One of his steers had been shot, not stolen, just left there as a message. His dog barked toward the hills, hackles raised. The rancher stepped closer, eyes scanning the darkness. A spark glinted for an instant far off, maybe a campfire, maybe a signal. He could feel he was being watched. He didn't chase. He only dragged the carcass to the edge of the field, buried it under stones, and went back to his porch. The frontier taught men patience like no book ever could. At dawn, the day of the river gathering arrived. Families from small ranches came in wagons, bringing baskets of food, wooden stools, and nervous hearts. Women laid quilts on the grass near the water. Children carried tin cups and stared wide-eyed at the riders arriving from the hills. The warriors came bareheaded, their horses adorned with beads and feathers, no weapons in sight. They rode with quiet dignity, their faces calm as they dismounted. The elder walked beside the young rancher to the center of the clearing. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, and even the sheriff stood near them. Across the riverbank, the cattle boss and his men watched from a distance, their horses restless, their hands never far from their belts. It was a fragile piece, like a glass set too close to the edge of a table. The young rancher began to speak, his voice carrying across the hush. He talked about respect, about land shared not owned, about how both sides had built this valley with sweat and loss. The schoolteacher read one of the old letters aloud, a story of two families, one native and one settler, who had survived a harsh winter by sharing food and faith. People listened. Some nodded, some wept quietly. For a moment it seemed the land itself sighed with relief. Then came the sound that froze everyone, the distant thunder of hooves from the south. The soldiers. Dust rose behind them like a storm wall, sunlight glinting off bayonets. The cattle boss turned in his saddle, smiling cold. He had planned it this way. The sheriff cursed under his breath and mounted his horse. "Get those people clear!" he shouted, but it was too late. The troop of blue-coated riders poured down the slope, rifles raised, shouting for everyone to stand down. The children screamed. The warriors froze in place, lifting empty hands to show they were unarmed. The young rancher stepped forward, shouting for the soldiers to hold fire, to listen. But confusion spread faster than words. One nervous trooper fired a warning shot that echoed off the canyon walls. Panic rippled through the crowd. A horse reared, knocking a woman to the ground. The warriors' horses whinnied and kicked up dust. The officer shouted orders, trying to regain control, but the sound of his voice was drowned in the chaos. The young rancher grabbed the reins of a frightened mare, pulling it aside before it trampled the children. He looked toward the elder, who stood unmoving, his staff held high, eyes blazing with sorrow more than anger. The elder's lips moved as if speaking to the wind. The sheriff rode between the two sides, waving his hat, yelling for calm. "Hold your fire," he roared. "They're unarmed." But the soldiers, seeing movement and dust, grew tense. One man aimed his rifle toward the ridge where a few young riders had appeared, scouts from the hills watching in fear for their families. The rancher saw it happen in an instant, the barrel rising, the finger tightening on the trigger. He shouted, breaking into a run toward the soldier, waving his arms. The shot cracked the air like thunder. The bullet missed the scouts but tore through the brim of his hat. The rancher stumbled, heart pounding, ears ringing. The elder dropped his staff into the dirt and stepped forward, his voice carrying through the chaos. "This land remembers truth," he cried, "and the truth is not written in fear." The soldiers hesitated, confused by his calm. The sheriff turned his horse, glaring at the cattle boss. "You wanted this," he shouted. The boss's face was pale now. Even he hadn't planned for things to spin this far. The warriors did not move, not even to shield themselves. They stood as the wind tore at their clothes, a wall of silence against the noise of rifles and shouts. The young rancher rose to his feet, dust streaking his face, and walked to stand between the lines, soldiers on one side, warriors and townsfolk on the other. "No more," he said, voice raw. "If blood spills here, it'll never stop." For a heartbeat, the world held still. The soldiers' hands trembled on their rifles. The children clung to their mothers. The wind carried the sound of the river running between them, steady and ancient. Everyone waited for one man to make the wrong move. The tension was a living thing, thick, suffocating, ready to snap. Then far up the ridge, a rifle cracked again. Not from the soldiers this time, not from the warriors, but from the unseen hands that had been waiting in the brush. A single shot that echoed like judgment. The elder gasped, his knees buckling as the staff fell from his hand and rolled into the dust. Chaos exploded. Horses reared. The sheriff lunged forward. The rancher caught the elder as he fell, blood staining the earth near the water's edge. The shouts blurred into one rising storm of fear and rage. The soldiers tried to pull back, but the warriors began to move, still without drawing weapons, only shouting grief and fury to the sky. The young rancher looked up, eyes blazing, holding the elder in his arms as the first drops of rain began to fall, dark, heavy, and slow. The sound of thunder rolled again, but this time it came from the hills where unseen riders gathered. their silhouettes black against the horizon. The rancher knew in his gut that the moment of peace had been stolen, and what came next would test the heart of every man in the valley. The air smelled of gunpowder and wet earth. The river ran red beneath the clouds, and the land held its breath once more. The rain came down harder, washing over the clearing by the river, mixing with the blood that darkened the soil. The young rancher held the elder close, his heart pounding against the roar of thunder. The old man's breathing was shallow, but his eyes stayed steady on the rancher's face. "Do not let them take our memory," he whispered. "The land remembers, and so must you." Then his hand went still, the strength leaving his fingers. The rancher bowed his head, feeling the weight of that moment sink deep into his chest. Around him, chaos had quieted into a stunned silence. The soldiers lowered their rifles, faces pale, realizing what had been done. Even the cattle boss sat frozen, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his earlier arrogance swallowed by fear. The sheriff dismounted and knelt beside them, voice breaking as he said, "We'll see that justice is done." But the rancher only looked up at him and said quietly, "Justice isn't a word on paper. It's what a man does after the dust settles." He rose slowly, carrying the elder's body to the edge of the water, where the current touched his boots. The warriors came forward in silence, their faces streaked with rain and tears. Together they laid the old man down beside the river he loved, wrapping him in a blanket of woven red and brown. No one spoke for a long while. Even the storm seemed to bow its head. When the clouds finally broke, the valley was covered in a pale gray mist. The soldiers stood aside, their commander stepping forward to face the young rancher. His eyes held regret. "This wasn't meant to happen," he said. "We came here under orders." The rancher met his gaze. "Orders don't wash away blood," he replied. The officer nodded, knowing there was no defense left to give. He promised to report the truth, to name the shot as murder, not mistake. Then he ordered his men to pull back and leave the valley at peace. It was the first honest act any of them had done since riding in. The townspeople who had come for the gathering stayed behind, helping bury the elder beneath a stand of cottonwoods. The schoolteacher recited from one of her old letters, speaking of friendship that survives hardship. The blacksmith placed his hammer in the dirt beside the grave, saying a man's tools should always serve something greater than himself. The sheriff stood apart, hat in hand, his face drawn with guilt. He promised to stand against the lies the cattle boss would surely spread. The rancher thanked him but said little. His eyes were on the horizon where the storm was drifting away, leaving behind a red sky touched with the first light of hope. Over the next few days, word of what happened spread far beyond Red Bluff. Some called it an accident, others called it a tragedy, but those who were there knew it was a turning point. The cattle boss tried to claim the land had been under threat, but too many witnesses spoke against him. The soldiers' own commander testified that the shot had not come from the warriors or from fear. It had come from the ridge, from a man hired to stir trouble. Within a week, the cattle boss had left town, his name cursed in every saloon and every ranch house from the valley to the fort. The railroad company delayed its plans, unwilling to lay tracks across ground now known for spilled blood. The town's pride had been cracked, but through that crack, something honest began to grow. The young rancher spent the next months rebuilding his fences and mending the parts of the ranch that had been neglected during the storm of conflict. The blacksmith's boy helped him, showing up every morning with a quiet determination. The two worked side by side in the heat and dust, the boy learning not only the ways of rope and horse but also the lesson his teacher had once spoken. Strength isn't in anger, but in how long a man can hold to his truth. The boy no longer flinched when he heard the distant drums that sometimes rolled from the canyons. Instead, he smiled and said they sounded like the heart of the land beating again. The town changed in small, quiet ways. The school teacher began her lessons with stories from both sides of the valley, teaching the children that history is not owned by one people, but shared by all who live through it. The sheriff resigned after a year, saying he'd seen enough of pride in a badge and not enough of mercy. He left behind a note for the rancher saying, "Peace is heavier than war, but it's worth carrying." The blacksmith reopened his shop with a new sign above the door that read, "Respect makes the iron strong." Even the saloon, once a place of cruel laughter, began to close earlier, its walls no longer echoing with hatred. Red Bluff had been scarred, but scars have a way of reminding men what not to forget. The young rancher often visited the elder's resting place by the river. Wildflowers had grown around it, their colors bright against the brown earth. He would sit there in silence, sometimes speaking softly to the water, as if the old man still listened through the current. He told him that the riders from the hills had returned to their homes, that peace had held longer than anyone expected, and that the people were learning to live side by side. He told him about the boy, about how he planned to pass on what he'd learned, the strength to stand, the patience to listen, the courage to forgive without forgetting. There were still whispers of unrest beyond the valley. Other cattle bosses wanted the railroad, and the railroad still wanted the land. But Red Bluff had found its voice, and the army knew better than to come charging into the same mistake. The sheriff's successor was a fair man, who kept both settlers and riders at the same table when trouble rose. The rancher joined those meetings, not as a man of either side, but as someone who had once stood between guns and silence and chosen peace. People listened when he spoke. They trusted him because he had earned their respect the hardest way a man can, by standing still when everyone else wanted to fight. Years passed. The ranch grew strong, and so did its story. Travelers passing through the valley would sometimes stop and ask about the man who faced 300 warriors at dawn and turned enemies into neighbors. The locals would point toward the hills and say, "He still rides there, keeping watch." And sometimes they were right. On quiet evenings, when the light turned gold and the air smelled of rain, you could see him riding the ridge, a lone figure against the sky, horse steady, gaze fixed on the land that had cost him so much but given him more in return. The boy grew into a man, took over the blacksmith's shop, and carried on the same lessons his friend had taught him. The school teacher's letters became a book that told the story of the river, gathering in the day peace nearly broke but didn't. She dedicated it to the man who stood for respect. When it was easier to draw a gun, the townsfolk read it aloud at gatherings, reminding the next generation of what nearly tore them apart and what finally brought them together. The rancher never liked being called a hero, but he smiled when he heard the story told to children sitting wide-eyed by firelight. He knew stories were how truth survived when memory faded. One spring morning, many years later, the young rancher, now older, with gray streaks in his hair and the calm of a man who had seen too much, rode out to the river once more. The cottonwoods were taller, the water running clear. He dismounted and walked to the old grave under the wildflowers. The world around him was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the call of a hawk overhead. He laid down a carved piece of wood shaped like a feather, something he had made with his own hands, and whispered, "The land remembers, and so do I." He looked up at the sky where clouds drifted like sails across a deep blue sea. The wind carried the scent of rain and grass, the same wind his father and the elder once knew. He felt peace, not the kind that comes from victory, but the kind that grows after forgiveness takes root. The valley had seen its share of fire and blood, but now it lived in quiet harmony. The people of Red Bluff traded, worked, and shared the same river. The drums that once called for battle now beat for festivals and harvest dances. Children who had never known fear played near the water's edge where the old man had fallen. Life, as it always does, had found a way forward. As he mounted his horse and turned toward home, the sun broke through the clouds, laying gold light across the valley. The hills glowed, the river shimmered, and the wind whispered like a promise. He smiled to himself, tipping his hat toward the distant town that had once turned its back on him and now stood as a place of unity. The old pain had not vanished, but it had softened into wisdom. Some wounds don't close, they teach. And as he rode away, his silhouette faded into the long stretch of light, leaving behind a land that had learned to breathe again. The story of the young rancher and the 300 warriors became part of the valley's memory, passed from mouth to mouth like the songs of the old days. People would say the land had a soul because it had known both hate and healing. And somewhere out there, where the river bends and the cottonwoods stand guard, the spirit of the elder still watches over the earth he loved, whispering to every rider who passes by that respect and peace are the truest strength a man can carry. The frontier had many legends, but none spoke louder than the one born beside that quiet river. The story of a young rancher who turned humiliation into honor and left behind not war, but a legacy of dignity that time itself could not wash away.